Okay, so welcome to our session this afternoon on enabling others to find their voice. So yeah, it's a warm welcome from me, Damien Wamfor. I'm the founder at Catalyst 14, and I'm pleased to have my colleague and partner Liz Palmer running the session today around VoicePrint and using VoicePrint in a one-to-one coaching. So anything you want to say, Liz, just before I introduce you and set up the session?
Just that it's really good to be here and good to be talking about VoicePrint because I've been involved with it for a while. So yeah, and hope that we can at least cover enough to give people a flavour of what it's about and, as you say, how you can use it in one-to-one coaching.
Thanks, Liz. So in terms of the session today, you are in listen-only mode. So please feel free to communicate over the chat panel. So yeah, you can see the sort of welcome messages that you're writing, but you will be able to share any points or questions as we're working through the session today. The session is being recorded, so it will appear on our YouTube channel later this week. And I think it's just, it always helps if you close down any other applications, and that just, sometimes they impact the transmission speed. So that's a useful strategy as well. So today the topic will be really around using VoicePrint in one-to-one coaching. So the title of the session is Enabling Others to Find Their Voice. And just really to introduce Liz. Liz is an executive coach, a coach trainer and a facilitator, and has been involved in VoicePrint for a while now. So the intention today is really to help us understand the VoicePrint model, to help us think about how it may be useful for our coaching clients in one-to-one coaching programs. And as part of that, I have asked Liz to come prepared with a couple of case studies to share as well. So that's the sort of intention, a high-level plan of the conversation that we're going to have for the next 45 minutes. As always, just to make sure that we're delivering what you would like to hear. It's just an opportunity for you to pose any questions that you have around this topic using the VoicePrint tool in coaching. Just so Liz and I get to understand what you're hoping to get from the session. So yeah, please feel free just to take a moment and just to put any questions in the chat panel, just so we can ensure we're delivering what you're hoping to get from the session. So I'm just going to pause whilst you may be just thinking about some questions there for Liz and the session today. Okay, thanks, Mike. I can see they're, really keen to understand what VoicePrint is and how it may benefit coaches and your clients, I imagine, as well. And thanks, Brody. So curious about case studies, how you've used it and the impact it's had. So yeah, please feel free to add any other questions there as we're going through the session. So Liz, let's just start with quite a straightforward question, really, in terms of just introducing this tool. So yeah, simply what is VoicePrint?
Yeah, what is it? So I thought I'd start actually if I talk a little bit about what it is and where it's come from, because I think that's also helpful, and then I can share the model with you. I think one of the really interesting things about VoicePrint is it is essentially a way of helping people understand the pattern of their talk, of how they use talk. And what's really interesting about it is we use talk so habitually. It's a bit like walking as children. We get up and walk and we don't think about it. We learn to talk and we don't really pay attention to how we talk. So VoicePrint fundamentally is a tool that helps us really understand our habitual patterns of how we have conversations and interactions with people. And And the other thing it does is it really connects us with the internal dialogue we have going on in our heads, which is what makes it really interesting for us as coaches and working with clients. So it connects us with the intention that we have in any conversation or interaction with what we then do with that intention and how we voice it, and then the impact we have. So whenever we talk about VoicePrint, really what we're trying to help people become more conscious of is intention, voice, and then impact. And are they having the impact that they're wanting to have, which of course is why it's so valuable in a coaching conversation. So I think in essence that's really what it's about. And by way of a little bit of background, I think what makes it very different to other things, so I'm sure Mike, Janie and Brodie, I know Janie and Brodie are very familiar with some other tools. Mike, I'm sure you are. So lots of other tools that are out there that are very helpful to us, things like MBTI, Insights. They focus on very much on personality, which is helpful. Sometimes the limitation of that is that people then don't know what to do with that and how to translate it into action. And so VoicePrint really sits between personality and behaviour. It's almost like it's a tool that occupies that territory, and what that means is it makes it very easy for people to grasp it quite quickly. It also means that it makes it really quite easy for people to see what they could change that's going to make a difference. So it makes it feel very possible that I can do something different without having to fundamentally be a different person. So I think that's also worth saying about it. It actually came from, I work very closely with Alan Robertson, who's the architect of it, and it came from his work as an HR director in manufacturing. And he also spent a lot of time in conversations with unions and with sort of the management team, although he said often it was the conversations with the management team were the harder ones. But he was slightly frustrated just with the number of conversations that were well-intentioned on both sides but didn't connect. He calls it a clash of intention. And that's what sparked his curiosity to develop the model. So it sort of comes from a long-held curiosity about how to make our conversations and interactions with people as impactful and to some extent transparent as they can be. So let me just pause there. I think there's a slide, Damien, that you can share. Actually, it just shows that sort of connection between personality and behaviour.
And I just before we move on, Liz, in terms of that sort of awareness raising, and I'm hearing you sort of say about not only does it give people an understand of the voices that they're using and the impact they're potentially having, but also the internal dialogue that's often playing out for them in conversation. And because obviously I've trained recently in the tool, and I'm sort of seeing the value of this with the one-to-one work that I'm doing. But will you be mentioning about the piece around the impacts when they're under pressure as well? Because I think that's quite an important aspect of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. So I think a couple of points. So one is, again, the value of the tool, I think, is although people can grasp it very quickly, and that is one of the great things about it, it also invites people to really get underneath what's going on for them underneath all of this. So, you know, if I'm sort of struggling to use the voice that is very direct, that is about being really clear about expectations and boundaries, it helps people start to really connect to, so what is it about that and where does that come from that stops me using that voice when I need to and using it well. So that's one piece about it. It has the potential for sort of great depth of exploration. And you're absolutely right, it also has a pressure profile. So it helps us understand what happens to our pattern of talk and communication when we're under pressure. And how that might change, and you know, whether we, if you like, whether we retreat or whether we step into something. So the fight, flight, freeze. And it also encourages us to be aware of how we hear others, because of course interactions are two ways. So I think the other thing that's really valuable about it, it helps us understand not only our own sensitivities to how we talk when we're under pressure, but also to how we hear others, because we all have sort of hot buttons, if you like, about what people say to us and how we might react to that. So I think that's another piece around it, is just being really aware of what your own sensitivities are and how you can manage those.
Yeah, no, great. And I know we'll talk about, the impacts that this has had, but for me, that just with the awareness raising that does, I think for the leaders I work with, it's really helping them understand, I suppose, observationally what they're seeing as well when they're in meetings and the types of talk that's happening, which I think is so powerful. So I'm just gonna share the model, Liz, just so you can start to talk to that in terms of just building up the picture of the model. Yeah.
And as you do that, Damien, I'm going to pick up on your last point, because one of the questions that I find, and I encourage others to ask, and I do ask of my coachees, is not only can we use this tool to help us become more effective for ourselves, but as you just said, asking the question, what does this conversation need, is a really useful way of not only using the model, but it also helps us to just take a step back. So there might be moments where you're sitting in a conversation or a meeting, and you may not be at that point in time directly engaged, but it's a really useful way of seeing what's happening in the conversation. How might I be able to contribute to it in a way that's going to really help the conversation? So the slide you're seeing now really is just the point that I've just made about the value of VoicePrint, of sitting between this sort of the world of psychometrics and the world of competence or behaviour. And I think, as I've said it, worth saying again, I think that's one of the valuable things about it, that it really does help people translate quite quickly, whatever their experience is. So as coaches, as you said, our work is about raising awareness. The real value here is of then making it seem very possible that I can do something different and try something different that's going to have an immediate impact, without, as you say, having to be fundamentally a different person. And I'll come on to a couple of the just sort of case studies and anecdotes of how I've seen coachees use it. And I know I've shared the story with you, Damien, of a lovely lady I work with, and I went in once and her PA took me to one side and said, "What have you done with her? She's completely different." And of course she wasn't different. She'd just chosen to approach a particularly difficult meeting in a different way. So
and that's your point around intention and impact, which I think is so strong in this model.
Yeah. So if you put the actual model up of the 9 voices, so what I thought I'd do is just very quickly, let me just talk to each of the voices just so you get a little flavour of it. And there's a lot more to it, but I'll give you a sense of it. So the research has led to these 9 voices, and they sort of sit in, as you say, around 3 axes of the triangle. So the top 3, inquire, probe and diagnose, are all what we call exploratory voices. So they are all about, in some way, shape or form, opening up or gathering information in a conversation. So very, very quickly and succinctly, inquire as a voice is very open-minded. So when I'm using inquire well, I don't have an agenda. So as coaches, of course, we need to exercise this muscle around this sort of open-minded inquiry. The probe voice is very much about digging underneath the surface. So in coaching terms, if you have a sense of something that's missing, or I've got a hunch that there's something here, or a hypothesis, and I start digging deeper, that's using the probe voice. It's trying to uncover what may the moment be hidden for someone. That's different to inquire, and it's also different to diagnose. So the diagnose voice is very much when I'm asking questions, and my intention is that I'm trying to connect up bits of information. I'm trying to either solve a problem or work out what's causing a problem. So sort of that causality or connecting of things. So we often think of it as a T. So if diagnose is across the top and probe is sort of going deeper. And again, the key thing with this is sort of beginning to just tune into, as I'm in this conversation, what is it that I am trying to do? You know, what is my intention? And how well do I then match that to the voice I choose, and how skillfully do I use the voice? So that's the other thing. So those are the three exploratory voices. The three voices of articulate, advocate, and advise are what we call positioning voices. In some way, they are trying to either sort of put a position into the conversation or gather up other positions that are already there. So the advocate voice does what it says on the tin. It is the voice of, this is what I think, this is my position, this is where I'm at with a conversation or any sort of interaction. So it's a really clear statement of that. That's different to advise. So when I'm advocating, my intention is to be clear about my own thinking or position. When I'm advising, my intention is to offer my experience or skills or knowledge to someone else, that they might do something with it. And the choice is theirs. So, you know, we would recognize instantly the people we'd go to for advice. So when you do this, I mean, interesting, everybody has their own profile, quite a unique profile, and often, I mean, it's a good question, do we do the jobs we do because of our profile, or does the profile come because we do the jobs we do? But certainly if you went to a solicitor or someone in that kind of role, you'd expect them to have a strong advise voice and a strong advocate voice. So that's advocate and advise. The articulate voice is the voice that gathers up the positions that are in the room. So it's the voice of summary. It's very neutral. It's a very powerful voice if things are getting heated in a conversation, to be able to gather it up. And gather, it's not just gathering up positions, it's gathering up emotions or how people are feeling. So those are the three voices that are positioning voices. And then the other three on the other side, so we've got direct, evaluate, and challenge, are what we call controlling voices, because they're seeking to assert some kind of control on the conversation. I've mentioned the direct voice already. The direct voice is very much, I call it the keep off the grass voice. It's the voice that's very clear about expectations, boundaries, what's required. There's a cultural element to this, which is also interesting. So in the UK, the direct voice is often couched in a lot of very polite language. If you go to Holland, they're much cleaner and clearer with it, and less afraid of it, actually. The evaluate voice is the voice that weighs up. So again, if I'm using it, my intention is to use my hands to, you know, balance pros and cons. So given what I'm hearing, what are the strengths and weaknesses of it? So for me, this is a voice I really do like. I also have to be quite careful with it, because it can, to others, it can be heard as criticism. So again, it's being aware of sensitivities. And then the last voice is the voice of challenge, and the challenge voice is there to interrupt. And I don't mean literally interrupt, I mean sort of energetically to interrupt a conversation or the flow of something. So you'll know you've heard a challenge voice if you're in a conversation and somebody says something and it almost feels like the brakes are put on, or it's like a handbrake turn, that everybody stops. So a challenge voice might be something like, are we really sure we're asking ourselves the right question here? It's designed to interrupt that, and its intention is always about improvement. So improving in some way, shape or form, either the content of what's being discussed, the process of what's being discussed. So that's its intention. What's interesting, of course, behind that is my version of improvement may be completely different to someone else's. So so you can get that sort of clash of intention, but it always comes from a belief behind improvement. So that's the model. I'm going to pause because I'm very aware that I can now get into a real flow of talking more about this because there's so much more in it. But let me just pause.
Yeah, and I suppose as an invitation to the group as you're listening, if there are any questions, just to clarify the model in terms of the 9 voices, or anything else that's just coming to mind as you're hearing Liz start to describe the model, please feel free to add those to the chat panel, just so that we can respond to them. And I suppose it's a bit like I was just going to reflect back, Liz, as well, is just that piece around sometimes I might use another voice to achieve the intent of that voice. So I'm just thinking about the challenge voice. Yeah, perhaps I use a different voice to actually achieve that place of interrupting, because I'm more comfortable, or perhaps my job requires that, or maybe I just haven't developed the challenge voice. Is that fair? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason, if you look at the 9 voices, we need all of these voices. So all the intentions that sit behind them are things that at some level we're going to have to get done or need to do at various points. And so you're absolutely right. So our profiles show us what we're perhaps more comfortable with and what we're less comfortable with, what we might use more of or less of. So it's a bit like the golf bag analogy. There'll be some I pull out, and every time I use it, it's sort of neatly so heads up the fairway and lands in the middle. And there'll be others that I use much less often and less skillfully. And so I can, in the moments where I need those, and it may be under pressure, they may not land as I hope they are. And you're also absolutely right about mismatching. So, and you and I have a chuckle about this now, don't we? Because one of the common mismatches is I ask a question when actually I don't mean to ask a question at all. So I think I asked you recently in a workshop, shall we give the delegates a break now? Now, actually behind that was, I think it's time that we gave the delegates a break now. So, which is my advocate voice. This is what I think. But and again, this is a sort of cultural thing as well, but we often will use questions to soften some of the more direct voices. And at some level, I say, when I'm working with my clients, I say to them, look, if your interactions are all going well and you're having the impact you want, that's great. This is not about suddenly trying to dissect the complexity of our language and our everyday conversations. This is really useful, though, when you're not having the impact you want, or when you're in an interaction that feels very familiar in terms of, I'm going to go and have this conversation again, and it's going to end up in this place again, which is not the place I want it to be. So yeah, that mismatching can be a really helpful way of thinking about how we use it. So I can see there are a couple of
questions. So let's just pick up on a couple of these, Liz. So Brody's just asking about culture. So does this apply to all cultures? Has there been any feedback with different cultures?
So it has been used worldwide in a lot of different countries. There is some research that Alan's done to sort of pull out what some of the cultural differences are. And so certainly, that sort of data is becoming, I think it's becoming more apparent, but there are some obvious ones. The Dutch direct one is an obvious one, but definitely culturally there are some differences. And it's useful to be aware of that. I mean, how that can often come out in a coaching conversation is really just to explore someone's perception or feeling about a voice and where that's come from. You know, because it will have some either cultural, or sometimes it can be linked back to your family and, you know, what happened to you when perhaps you used that voice. Yeah.
Yeah, from Alicia, she's just saying she's curious about the expression of the professional context voice. You mentioned the solicitor example and the difference between personal and inherent, not professional context system voice. Does that come across in the tool?
Okay, so I'm not sure I completely understand the question. So let me just see if I answer it correctly, Alicia, and if not, you can ask it again. So I think what I'm hearing is the difference between when we sort of use our professional voices versus at home. Is that how you're hearing it, Damien?
Yeah, so the inherent, the natural voice versus the professional context, you know?
Okay. So I think my experience with it tells me, as with a lot of things, that we probably tend to be slightly more conscious when we're at work, especially when we're not under pressure. And sometimes at home we might be a little bit freer around how we use our voices. So it's always useful to get a little bit of feedback from both, actually. But this does, the tool gives you, so there are 3 tools. There's a self-perception tool, a 360, and the group profile. So the self-perception is, as it says, it's your own perception of yourself, which I do use a lot with groups if I'm doing some work with teams, and that is enough to give people some awareness. The 360 obviously is really interesting because it gets some perception from others. But whether you're in a work context or at home, it does shine a light on just habitually what you do, sort of just, habitual patterns that you have. And it's not to say that you will always do something in a particular way, but it will be a familiar pattern. And if you ask people around you, often the reply you'll get is, yeah, that's how you are in a conversation often. Not all the time, but often. And as with all these things, Damien, there's no ideal profile. It's really just about raising awareness so that I can be more choiceful about the interaction that I'm in to have the impact that I want, and also to connect with, we keep sort of going up here, to connect with what's going on for me internally and what's my intention.
And I think I'll just add a couple of pieces, if that's okay, Liz. I think, just picking up on Alicia's point, what the profile shows is where the individual is likely to spend or give more energy in terms of the voices, and less energy. And again, it's a bit like any sort of model around overplayed strengths about what happens to that individual when they're under pressure, and whether they're overplaying any of these voices in those moments. So I think, as with any model, the conversation that sits around this is really where you start to unpick the difference between, you'll get to listen to the inherent voice versus the professional voice or the learned voice. I think it's really an interesting question, but it really comes through in the model in terms of my experience through the conversation. So Liz, I'm just wondering if it'd be useful perhaps to talk about some actual application, just to bring this to life a bit. So, in terms of a couple of case studies, just so people can understand the relevance for clients. I think as a coach, I just want to say that when I first looked at this model, really sort of shone a light on, I like your phrase, the repertoire, conversational repertoire that perhaps we're using as coaches, and actually where we may need to flex more at times. But just in terms of your work with clients, can you share a couple of examples?
Yeah, of course. And I think the other question that we asked, which I know really resonated with one of your coaches, Damien, was to ask someone, what's your conversational reputation? which is not a question we often get asked. But if you ask people that, that can really shine a light on what do they experience of you when they're in conversation with you. So just, as I said, a couple of examples. So Kochi that I was working with, she's director of a research institute. So one would expect that she would have a very strong advocate voice because she spent a lot of her time with external stakeholders representing the organisation, and in times of sort of funding, she was in a big funding review, so she really did need to represent the organisation. So she had a very strong advocate voice. She also, because her background was as a scientist, she had a very strong diagnose, probe voice. So she sort of had this pattern of really getting into the trying to solve the problem, dig underneath it. So she had a really interesting pattern that was entirely understandable given her work. What she was challenged by was she recognised under pressure that she just slipped into the pattern of advocating even more and sometimes articulating even more. So if I advocate, if I tip over the edge of advocate, I can preach. And if I tip over the edge of articulate, I can become very verbose. And she recognised both of those things. She was going into a big funding review. And actually, some of the work that we did, and it was her PA who said, "What have you done to her?" And the reason she said that, so there was a lot of concern in the organisation, a lot of high emotion and worry about the funding review. And so she went into an internal meeting, and her habitual pattern would have been to go in and advocate. Let me tell you, what I know, what's going on, what my position is, what I'm doing. And when we explored it, she stopped and said, actually, I think I need to go in there and inquire. I just need to have an open mind and try and understand where everybody else is coming from, so that then I can perhaps tailor my advocacy to that. So she did. She walked in and she just asked, what everyone was thinking and what questions they had and what would be helpful. And she, if you like, toggled between inquire and articulate for a bit. She listened, she played it back, and then she went to advocate. And that was the only thing she did. And that's when everybody just experienced her very differently, because what they were expecting was her normal pattern, which, for a lot of the time is very effective because, she's a very successful woman. So I think that's, it's a good illustration of, you don't have to fundamentally change, but it's just being aware of what does this conversation require of me? What do the people in this conversation require? And how can I best match that? And it's also about an awareness of knowing the impact of these different voices, then I can be more choiceful. So knowing that, actually when we toggle between or move between inquire and articulate with someone, and you see this in coaching a lot, what I'm doing is it's what we actually call iterative sense making. So if I'm doing it with a coachee, I'm helping them have the space to make sense of something. If I'm doing it in conversation with someone, I'm taking time with them for us each to understand where we're coming from. So there's a lot more underneath the model which comes out the more you work with it, about patterns that we have if we know the impact of certain types of conversation, then we can deliberately choose those when we need them. So that was one example. The other example, again, another lady she had a really interesting pattern. She's a catering manager, what I call a plate spinner on the most incredible scale, this lady. She had a very strong direct voice. She was known as the person who was very happy to have difficult conversations with people. And she was very good at it. She had a lot of youngsters working for her, and she really had a sense of care around them and wanting to, if you like, put them on the right path early in their career was her feeling. She was a mother, and so she was very happy to be very clear with them. Interestingly, she was very struggling to say no for herself. So she would just keep taking things on. So actually it was her advocate voice that was suffering. So she was very good at representing the organisation, but really not representing her. And so the work was about helping her strengthen that voice of where I am and what, almost what I need in this. And again, just that, and she recognised it was often when her manager would ask her to do something, she might just manage a quick pushback, but the minute he pushed back, she gave in. So again, it was a little bit about helping her really strengthen that. And that made a big difference for her. And then just one other, I'm still keeping an eye on time, but one other actually, which was a lovely, so another coach I worked with who had just stepped onto the board actually, and his was very much about finding his voice when he wasn't coming from a place of expertise. So he is an engineering director, so absolute confidence around his own technical subject, but was struggling in the board meetings when it wasn't his subject. And so he was able to use the model to really engage with what does this conversation need? And how can I facilitate that when I don't have the expert knowledge? And he shared a lovely example with me of sitting in a meeting. He watched his colleagues make a decision or become very decided very quickly. And if I'm decided, I'm going to be heading down the bottom of this model to direct, challenge, advise, advocate. And he just had a sense that this decision really sort of warranted a little bit more time and conversation. And so he deliberately went to the place of articulate to gather it all up. And we call this the articulate and evaluate, we call the corridor of objectivity in a conversation. So he thought, I'm going to go there and just gather up everything that's been said. And then he just posed a question to them, about, I can't remember what the question was. And he said the impact of doing that was that it just encouraged everyone to go up to the top again. Let's explore a little bit more. And actually, as a result, they changed their decision. Now, that wasn't his intention. He didn't have an agenda here of trying to get them to do that. He just had a sense that there was more to be explored. So I think that's really, again, a lovely illustration of it's not always about my personal agenda. It is sometimes about serving the wider conversation, how I can do that. Especially in situations where perhaps others are under pressure and can't step away from it. How can I do that? So those are just a few examples. Again, I'm going to pause because otherwise I can carry on.
Yeah, no, some really, really rich examples, Liz. And so if there were sort of, 2 or 3 themes that you would say as coaches, this might be a time when I introduce this tool, what comes to mind?
I think definitely the theme of transition, of people moving up. I think that example of moving up onto a board was particularly, can be particularly helpful. And it's not necessarily onto a board, but any sense of moving into a greater level of seniority. Because I think that can really, we do a lot of work around imposter syndrome. I think that certainly is a place where this can really help. Because again, I think it really does give people that sense of, if you like, having more capability than they realise. So that would definitely be one.
Yeah.
For me, I'm often, when I use it with most of my coaches. I don't always use it, but I'm often just listening out for any sense of someone, wanting to have a greater impact in certain situations. Or where there's a sense of that they're aware of a pattern that they're likely to go into. So that the lady I was describing, who's the director, she knew very well what was likely to happen to her. In this sort of big funding review. She knew very well what her stress response was, and she knew that it was likely to get triggered. So using it in those situations also really helpful. But in a way, David, it's a hard question to answer, because actually when I think about the coaches I've used it with, it's been a lot of, quite a breadth of situations. But I think absolutely the transition one is what I would definitely say. And actually at some level, most of our coaches are in some kind of transition.
Yeah, and the other words I just want to emphasize that piece around the impacts they're having, because what I'm hearing you say is, through the coaching process, there's some subtle shifts they're making in terms of the way that they're holding the conversation and actually creating a different impact. That's what came out of me from those examples that you shared. So I'm just going to again pause. If there are any other questions coming through, please feel free to add those in or reflections. But Liz, if coaches are interested in this tool, and perhaps tell just a bit about the accreditation or training may be useful.
Yeah. So the accreditation is a 2-day program. So on day one, we sort of take people through the model, and we use a number of case studies to illustrate it. So it's a very practice-rich environment, and because we firmly believe you have to really use some real examples to get underneath it, rather than it being sort of someone like me talking at you. So day one is very much about the model and some of the nuances of the model, working through some case studies, really to build people's confidence to go away and then have, after day one, so you get 2 practice voice prints that you can use with 2 clients. So go away, you have your practice sessions, and then day 2, we come back together and we use those practice sessions as a way of deepening the people's understanding and knowledge. So what we get each of the delegates to do is to talk through their practice case. There are a series of questions to sort of spark their learning. And as people are listening to someone else's case, they're reflecting on what's coming up for them as they're looking at that profile, what questions they might have. And that's how we run it. So it's very much an experiential 2 days. Excuse me 1 second. So then as a result of that, you're accredited to use all 3 tools, which is the 360, the self-perception profile and the group profile. We touch on them just slightly, just so that you feel confident enough to use them. Then away you go. So then you get your own VoicePrint dashboard, and it's very easy to use, and you can sort of administer your own profiles. And it's done it's really done mostly on a pay-as-you-go basis. So once you've got the accreditation, you just pay for the consumables as you use them.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd recommend it. So yeah, I mean, if there are any final questions, please feel free to add those to the chat panel. We're sort of approaching the sort of end of the session in terms of the time today. I think in terms of as well group work, I know you mentioned the group profile, but I think also facilitating conversations with teams about how they're relating, taking the group through this process, you could sort of imagine the value that the group will receive in terms of not just their own profile, but also helping them think about how they're holding the conversations, whether the conversation's open or whether it's being sort of closed down quite quickly due to the voices that are being expressed. So really, really rich, I think, addition to a toolkit, Liz. It's just my reflection. Really, really appreciate your time today. I hope that's been useful for everybody. Is there anything else you'd just like to say, Liz, just to close the session down?
Well, just thank you. I mean, The other thing I was just going to say, as you're talking about, actually, it's actually fun. And it's a fun tool to use. So my experience with groups is people actually really enjoy using it. There is a depth to it, and there's a lightness to it. As with all these things, it gives us a language, to have a conversation about how we speak in a different way. As I said, you and I now enjoy picking each other up on our mismatches. So yeah, so thank you everybody. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, the recording will appear on YouTube by the end of the week. So yeah, thanks for dialing in. Look forward to connecting again soon, and go well in the meantime.